Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge.
Fire continues to burn. I can see the flames through the thick smoke. As I walk through Brooklyn to get to this position, I can tell you, as Juliette alluded to, the bridge has pretty much been blocked off. Everyone is being diverted. There is just no way into the city except for emergency vehicles. I did pass through a couple of parks and on some of the streets, and before, when I reported about an hour ago, there were people at their gas pumps who turned to look at the smoke that was coming from the city. So I'm stepping out of bodegas and stores to look. Now people are gathering in large groups. In fact, in one corner, I saw a group of people actually holding hands and praying. As I stand on the Manhattan Street, which is closed, it is open to pedestrian traffic. Some people are walking around, but there's just no way for them to, as I look out, something else that I can't see. I just blinked my eyes. I looked up at the hundreds of people in the background going, oh my God, and the second building appears to have gone down.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Ben. That is the second building that has gone down. It came out like a plume of smoke, like a banana unpeeling, plumes of smoke coming out, and then absolutely nothing. And now where there were two huge buildings, two huge towers, there is now nothing but plumes of smoke.
There's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no country. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. No religion to imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us.
Outside, we made it about a block. We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
Planned to take down a building.
All the way down. I was watching and running.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
Sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us. emotions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, brotherhood of man. Imagine all people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us in the world as one.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Gone, man.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Welcome back. Millions of people watched the horror of 9/11 right before their very eyes, live on television. 2 planes crashing into the World Trade Center, and less than a couple of hours later, both towers, of course, collapsing. My next guest says that hijackers may not have brought down the towers by themselves. Here to explain his controversial theory, Stephen Jones. He's a professor of physics at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Professor Jones, thanks for coming on.
Sure, thanks, Tucker.
Well, just sum up this, obviously, your theory, just the one sentence that I just explained in the intro, contradicts what we all think we know about how these towers collapsed. Quickly sum up your explanation for what happened.
Well, I'd like to start with this paper that you referred to. It's available online. What I'm doing, Tucker, is presenting evidence but it's a hypothesis to be tested. That's a big difference from a conclusion. And so I just wanted to clarify that. But to sum up, I've looked at the official reports by FEMA and so on regarding the collapse of these buildings.
Right.
I'd like to look at the collapse of Building 7 in just a minute. It was not even hit by a jet, so we should look at that one.
The 2 towers, the explanation has been that the fire inside was so intense that it weakened the structural steel and that each floor collapsed down upon the next in a pancake fashion, and they imploded in on themselves. Is that essentially, I think, what people think?
Yeah, that's basically it, yeah. And so what I've done is to analyze these reports. But I would like to do a little experiment with you, Tucker, if I could. I sent out a video clip of the collapse of Building 7, because most people haven't actually seen that one, and that's the crux of the argument that I'm presenting.
Okay, sum up very quickly the argument for us. You believe there were explosives in the buildings planted by someone, detonated.
Well, yeah.
Is that correct?
In other words, the hypothesis to be tested is there's two hypotheses here. One is fire and damage caused all three buildings to collapse.
Okay.
The other is that explosives in the buildings may have caused the collapse. And so then we analyze and see which fits the data better. And I've done that in my 25-page paper.
I want to read you a quote from the Deseret Morning News, a paper in Utah from you. I'm quoting now. "It is quite plausible that explosives were pre-planted in all three buildings and set off after the two plane crashes, which were actually a diversion tactic. Muslims are probably not to blame for bringing down the World Trade Center buildings after all." That's, I would think, pretty offensive to a lot of people listening. Do you have any evidence for that? I mean,
well, not to the Muslims, I might say.
Well, that's a good.
I've had a lot of emails.
I'm sure your writings have been greeted with glee in Islamabad and Peshawar and places like that. But for Americans,
well, I haven't received any notes from there, but just good people. I have Muslim friends. Let me read, for example, but I'm not going to let you off the hook. I really want to do this experiment with you.
We don't have a lot of time for experiments, Professor, but if you could just give us one thing to hold on to. How you make these claims or appear to make these claims. Do you have any evidence that there were bombs in the building?
Sure. Let's start with the collapse of Building 7. Can you roll the video clip that I sent to you?
Okay, I'm not sure if we can, but to specify, that is World Trade Center building number 7, smaller than the other two, was not hit by a plane, of course, yet it collapsed.
Right, it's 47 stories.
That's right.
24 steel columns in the center.
Right.
Trusses asymmetrically supported. Now, I can't see what you're seeing, so
we just
are you rolling that?
No, we just see the building. And just so our viewers know, the explanation that I think is conventional is that there was a large tank of diesel fuel stored in the lower level of that, which caught fire, and the resulting fire collapsed the building.
Well, that's basically it, yeah. But as we read in the FEMA report, it says here, and I put this in my paper, of course, the best hypothesis, which is the only one they looked at, fire, has only a low probability of occurrence. Further investigation, analyses are needed to resolve this issue, and I agree with that.
Okay.
But they admit there's only a low probability. And if you look at the collapse, you see what I've studied is the fall time, the symmetry, the fact that it first dips in the middle, that's called the kink, which is very characteristic, of course, of controlled demolition.
Professor, I am sorry that we are out of time, and I'm not sure that
one other thing I want to mention about...
Okay, if you can hit it, with it quickly.
All right. Okay, here we go. Molten metal in the basements of all three buildings.
Right.
And yet all scientists now reasonably agree that the fires were not sufficiently hot to melt the steel. So what is this molten metal? It's a direct evidence for the use of high-temperature explosives such as thermite. Thermite produces molten iron as an end product.
Okay.
So we do have... yeah, it's a very short time, but people will read the paper, then I talk about the molten metal, the symmetry of the collapse, and the weaknesses and inadequacies of the fire hypothesis.
Professor, we're going to have to leave it to our viewers who are interested enough to follow up to do just that. We appreciate your coming on, even if I don't understand your theories. We appreciate you trying to explain them. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Tucker.
Thanks.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
So what was the cause of the devastating explosive failure that happened at the World Trade Center?
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions. And the explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
There was a third explosion.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
We heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted.
Yeah, detonated.
Take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not
10 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, just collapsing on itself. This is a place where thousands of people work. We have no idea what caused this. If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Some of the people out, then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses. So I don't know how many people were there. I know there was a lot of firefighters. But
New York's bravest never had a chance.
We really never even got to that close to the building. An explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
The FBI is here, as you can see. They had roped this area off. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
Most of the victims so far were people outside the blown-up buildings.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
To me, it sounded like an explosion. Then the building, the rolling sound sounded like the building collapsed.
Top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
Next thing we know, it was boom, boom, and the floor started shaking. And then we saw debris fall down, and next thing we know, we had to get out of the building. We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
Well, me and Mr. Hess, the corporation counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Flew us back into the 8th floor.
I was making my way to the foot of the World Trade Center. Suddenly, while talking to an officer who was questioning me about my press credentials, we heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse.
Rose Housey, one of our CNN producers, is on the phone. Rose, what do you got?
I'm about a block away, and there were several people that were hanging out the windows right below where the plane crashed, when suddenly you saw the top of the building start to shake, and people began leaping from the windows in the north side of the building. You saw 2 people at first plummet, and then a third one, and then the entire top of the building just blew up, and splinters of debris are falling on the street.
We just saw that as well. The second tower, the only one that was standing, tower number 1, we saw some kind of explosion, a lot of smoke come out of the top of the tower, and then it collapsed down onto the streets.
When I tried to save people, in a moment we heard a big explosion coming down. Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them, and it was a big explosion. Everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, all this is not snow, this is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
The streets of the financial district covered with debris, in some cases ankle deep. Cars on fire, cars just turned by the force of the explosions. It was like something no one had ever seen.
This huge, incredible force of wind and debris actually came up the stairs, knocked my helmet off, knocked me to the ground.
We started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was as if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
Go downstairs, the foreman tells me to go to remove the containers. As I'm walking by the main freight car of the building, in the corridor, that's when I got blown. I mean, the impact of the explosion, of whatever happened, it threw me to the floor.
And that's when everything started happening.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
Ooh, my goodness me.
That's all that's standing are the Twin Towers right now in the background. That's all that's standing. That's it. That's all that's left.
So you're literally right inside. What time did you actually
I don't even know.
These
That was actually, I rode my motorcycle right up from there. That was like about an hour ago, not even.
It's absolutely.
Look at that. That's all that's left.
Do you know whether that's the South Tower or the North Tower?
That's the South Tower.
And you saw no sign of life in here whatsoever?
No, I went all the way right there. Like, I don't know if they edited it out yet, but there's a big hole going down to the ground. There's nobody. But the firemen said, you know, that there's been a lot of people dead, like a lot of firemen died.
Because there were firemen in the building at the time trying to help people evacuate from the building.
Yeah, they said 200 people died. I thought the fireman I saw too said 200 people died already.
And this wall here, this is from part of the tower itself?
Yeah, that's the South Tower, the lobby. And it's all the smoke, and there's still fire going on in there right now.
Are you walking across?
Yeah, see,
you're walking across, and that's your friend also with a photograph. And the building on the right that occasionally appears is a building adjacent?
Yeah, and it's just gouged. Like, the parts of the Twin Tower just gouged out the building. See, that's the concourse below. That's going down like 20 feet or so.
See this destruction on television, and we see the videotape. It's a bit hard to understand where things were or where are they now. Can you tell us, can you point out what is what in this maze of rubble and destruction?
This was the South Tower. This was 104, 106 stories tall. This is what is left. Up there was the North Tower. And you look, and you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized. And
what's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out of the fire?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground, that there's still fire underneath, smoldering.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
Obviously, the cameraman knows he's in trouble on that one, and everybody's starting to run when they see Tower 1 falling to the ground. And when you're running like that, just in fear for your life, you have no idea how close that is behind you.
You don't dare look back.
And it's just coming from every street. Look at that.
There has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising. And I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower, but there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and now it looks almost like a mushroom cloud explosion, this huge billowing smoke in the second tower. This was the second of the 2 towers hit. And I cannot see behind that smoke, obviously, as you can either. The first tower in front has not changed. And we see this extraordinarily and frightening scene behind us of this second tower. now just encased in smoke. What is behind it, I cannot tell you.
The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it pulled it down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
That should be it.
It has completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
Appearing to fall away from the rest of the building. Can we go to the tape now? Here we go, right here. This is, I mean, when you look at it, the building has collapsed. That tower just came down.
I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
Over an hour. I want to underscore again that both towers have been hit. Both towers, each tower was hit by an aircraft, incoming aircraft.
Again, and I know that for many of you, you've heard this a lot, but I think it's important as people join us as they do in moments like this. They are coming in all the time, that there have been attacks in 2 American cities, New York and in Washington. The trade centers here in New York have been hit by airplanes. In Washington, there is a large fire at the Pentagon. The Pentagon has been evacuated. And there's, you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing. Good Lord. There are no words. You can see large pieces of the building falling. You can see the smoke rising. You can see a portion of the side of the building now just being covered on the right side as I look at it, covered in smoke. This is just a horrific scene and a horrific moment.
Oh my God.
Here it is. That's a videotape replay.
Also, we're trapped by this. And here is the second tower that's coming down, and this was a similar situation. This defies belief.
Again, what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Let's just stay with this photograph or this graphic for just a second. Well, no, there's number 7 coming down. When you think that part of the component of news coverage around the country every year is the excitement and the fun that people get watching an old building being demolished, and they wire it very carefully for days, and it's a very careful operation in order to make sure that a building comes down safely. I think the last one we saw was when they brought down one of the old casinos in Las Vegas. I mean, this is just stunning to see these things come down.
Trek Live, we have had little relief here. Take a look at this. About an hour ago, World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. A 42-story building. No word of any casualties in the building. It was the one calamity that was not a surprise.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Stunning statements from a BYU professor tonight regarding 9/11. He thinks planes alone did not bring down the World Trade Center towers. Both towers collapsed in place after terrorist attacks, and later that day, World Trade number 7, which was never hit by a plane, fell in less than 7 seconds. Brian Malahy spoke to the professor today and joins us from the roof of the Wells Fargo Center. A crazy theory, Brian, or any validity to this?
Well, Professor Stephen Jones got an email today asking, are you some kind of nutcase? And actually, he's written an academic paper for peer review. It's been well received, he says, among his colleagues at BYU, and it is essentially this. The buildings fell on September 11th, not from planes, but from explosives that were intentionally set.
Images seared in our minds. We saw the planes hit, the explosions and fire, so hot, Fortress Towers could not stand. Stephen Jones says, not so fast.
They're sticking with this one hypothesis. It's almost they have blinders on. It's got to be fires and damage.
Jones is a 20-year physics professor at BYU who's penned an academic paper raising another hypothesis. Explosives pre-positioned in the buildings.
Notice how it's straight down.
Especially intriguing to Jones, World Trade Center number 7, damaged and ablaze from tower debris, but never hit by a plane.
Symmetrically now, it doesn't topple over, as you might expect from what we call the second law of thermodynamics. It comes straight down. This is the goal of pre-positioned explosives in a controlled demolition.
If explosives detonated like these, if they did, it begs the question, who set the explosives?
Sure. And I try not to go there too much because we have to answer the first question first, the scientific issue first. We need to consider all options for the collapse of these buildings. Let the chips fall where they may.
Jones says that models conducted in tests since 9/11 have not been able to duplicate what happened to the buildings. He is not saying that this is a proven theory. He says, in fact, that it's a hypothesis, but he wants a fresh, new, independent investigation. Mark, back to you.
Definitely something to think about, though, Brian.
Yeah,
all right.
sure is.
Thanks a lot.
The collapses of the Twin Towers and building number 7 had to have been examples of controlled demolition, brought about by thousands of explosives placed throughout each of the buildings. No foreign terrorist could have obtained the kind of access to the buildings this would have required. One reason for concluding that the 3 buildings were brought down by explosive is the very fact that they did collapse. High-rise steel frame buildings have never, before or after 9/11, been caused to collapse by fire. Even when, as in the Philadelphia fire of 1999 and the Madrid fire of February of this year, the fires were much larger, much hotter, and much longer lasting than any of the fires in the World Trade Center. The second reason is the specific nature of the collapses, each feature of which points to explosives. For example, the buildings collapsed straight down and at virtually free fall speed, as in controlled demolitions. And then the rubble smoldered for months afterwards. With regard to the Twin Towers in particular, many people in the building said that they felt or heard explosions. Virtually all the concrete of these enormous structures was pulverized into very fine dust.
This was the South Tower. This was 104, 106 stories tall. This is what is left. Up there was the North Tower. And you look, and you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Try this. Get a piece of concrete and drop it a little over 1,000 feet and see if it pulverizes into very fine dust. It won't happen. Much of this dust, along with steel and aluminum, was blown out horizontally from the buildings several hundred feet. Most of the steel beams and columns came down in sections about 30 feet long, conveniently ready to be loaded onto trucks. And pools of molten steel were found beneath the rubble.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright, reddish-orange color.
These and even more effects point to the existence of very powerful, precisely placed explosives. A third thing supporting the theory of controlled demolitions is evidence of a deliberate cover-up. If the building's steel columns and beams had indeed been broken by explosives, an examination of the steel would have revealed this fact. However, although it is normally a federal offense to remove anything from a crime scene, the steel was quickly loaded onto trucks and put on ships headed for Asia to be melted down. I will mention one more example of the cover-up. Insofar as there is an official story as to why the towers collapsed, it is the pancake theory, according to which the floors above the destruction caused by the airplanes collapsed on the floor below, and then those floors collapsed on the floor below that, and then it pancaked all the way down. Now, even if this theory were remotely plausible, can you imagine it pancaking at free fall speed? The other problem is what happened to the 47 massive steel columns that constituted the core of each of these twin towers. They were the weight-bearing structures of each tower. Those 47, even if the pancake theory were true, those 47 steel beams should have been sticking up at least several hundred feet into the air, just like the old phonographs, where sometimes the 78 records would collapse, but the spindle's still sticking up in the air. You should have had 47 spindles still sticking up in the air. Well, what did the 9/11 Commission report do about that problem? It avoided the problem incredibly by simply denying the existence of these columns, even though those columns, I'm not making this up. These columns were the unique feature of these towers when they were first built. So, the Commission report, after saying falsely that most of the weight of each tower was borne by the steel columns in its exterior walls, this supposedly authoritative report said the interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped. Such a desperate lie is a sure sign of a cover-up. In any case, when we look at all these features of the collapses, the idea that they could have been caused by the impact of the airplanes plus the resulting fires is ridiculous. This was even clearer with regard to building number 7, which wasn't hit by any airplane. And yet it came down about 5:30 that afternoon. Its collapse remains so impossible to explain, except as controlled demolition, that the 9/11 Commission report did not even mention it, as if the collapse of a 47-story building was not worthy of comment. And it only had fires on floors number 7 and 12 of 47 stories.
Big round of applause for Mr. Jeff King.
Okay. I studied physics at MIT. I did electrical engineering for about 8 years. I've had quite a bit of practical engineering experience. When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things that I did was to speak with one of my patients, who is a retired Army Corps of Engineers fellow who's done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos that are available of it, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, which represent little puffs of smoke essentially coming out of the buildings initially, which were clearly a sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinions beyond that, but he said without doubt that it was a controlled demolition. That sort of set me on the path of continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could. And the question I pose, what don't we know and why don't we know it, is sort of addressing the fact that at this point we still do not really have a meaningful explanation for what happened to the buildings. We have had several studies at this point, which I will go into, as to trying to determine a plausible scenario for the collapse. As of this point, none of them have presented us with anything that I think could be reasonably called a convincing and detailed account of why the collapse has occurred. And the question that's been addressed previously, the enormous destruction of physical evidence, as Chris was saying, the site was scrubbed very thoroughly. Out of the entire mass of the buildings that were destroyed, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, who are now doing the ongoing investigation, managed to save about 240 pieces out of the entire building. All of the rest of it was basically recycled. The obvious question is what does it mean that there was a controlled demolition? At the simplest level, it means that someone had a lot of access to the buildings over a long enough period of time to set this up. It implies, as many other things have tonight, that the people who had effective control of the site had an interest in having it scrubbed and making sure that no information was available, that a forensic reconstruction couldn't be done. Even in much smaller catastrophes, we typically will reconstruct things as completely as possible. For example, TWA Flight 800 pieces were dredged off the bottom of the sea. A complete reconstruction was done to allow a detailed analysis. In this case, the exact opposite was done. The first report that was really issued on this was issued by FEMA in collaboration with the Society of Civil Engineers. There was basically a volunteer team from ASCE that had very limited access to the site. A lot of the pieces that they were able to retrieve were retrieved by going to landfills and trying to find interesting pieces before they were disposed of. The initial FEMA report basically acknowledged that the kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material. And the second point being that the fuel here really was strictly office contents. If you think of a modern office with copying machines, computers, and as has been previously mentioned, the smoke, particularly from Building 2, just before it collapsed, was very black looking. This is generally an indication of an inefficient fire in which there's not enough oxygen for the amount of fuel. These types of fires typically burn very cool. They are not hot flames like blowtorches. The cores themselves, basically, if you've seen diagrams of the building, there's a large central rectangle in each of the towers that contained 47 columns. And these columns basically were the primary structural support of the building. They were given the role of supporting the whole gravitational load of the building. Since they were so strong, it would have been reasonable to think that they would have withstood, at least to some extent, the collapse. But in fact, as we see after the buildings collapsed, there was basically only little stubs of these things standing up a floor or two above the ground level. The cores did not have much in them that would burn. The cores basically were dedicated to things like elevator shafts, utility shafts, stairways. So you have drywall material, you have a little bit of carpeting, you don't really have any inflammable material in the core itself. The core was specifically designed so it could not function as a chimney. They did not want, in the case of a fire, for the fire to be able to travel through the elevators or for air to come in through the elevators. So they were designed with what this architect, Aaron Swirsky, I believe it was, referred to as a hermetically sealed system. There were fire shutters that were designed to close off the core in the event of an event like this. And those, as far as we know, functioned properly, which means that there was a very limited amount of oxygen available. Okay, as far as the issue of what failed and how, some of the initial suggestions, and these showed up in the NOVA documentary, which is a good example of what I like to call proof by computer animation. Thomas Egar, who was a material scientist but not a structural engineer, who became a spokesman for these documentaries, indicated that the floors had somehow failed, that the trusses supporting the floors had failed. This was the theory that was put forward actually in the initial FEMA report. Subsequently, there have been basically complete contradictions of that. Jim Hoffman has done quite a bit of research which is available on the web concerning the problems with this idea that the floors would have simply fallen. There was a study done by Weidlinger Associates. The chief engineer there was Mathis Levy, who's a very well-known authority on building collapses. He specifically disavowed the idea of pancaking or collapsing of the floors. And the most recent official report we have on this, which is from National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, rejected the idea that floor collapse was part of it. And so as a result, we have basically no sequential model at this point. What NIST has suggested is that there was some kind of simultaneous collapse of the cores, but they have not attempted to give any kind of modeling as to whether those cores could have in fact been destroyed by the fires in the way that they claim. Unfortunately, the material that would have allowed a detailed fire analysis, the actual physical evidence, is all gone. One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures that I've seen. This type of flow is something that we are familiar with in physics. It occurs in only two situations that we know of naturally. One is in volcanic eruptions where a large amount of material is suddenly exploded into the air and basically forms small particles. The other situation is something called turbidity currents. These occur along the edges of the continental shelves where mud or sediment will slump, become suspended in water. And the common thread is that you have large amounts of a dense material that is suspended very quickly in a fluid, thereby creating another denser fluid, which is in effect the dust cloud. And that fluid can achieve considerable velocities. The problem with creating this sort of slurry of fine particles is that there really is no mechanism that has been proposed. We have concrete floors with carpeting or flooring over them. We have furniture. We have floors basically that are coming together in a collapse, but the concrete is basically protected under these layers. Early in the collapse, in the very first moments, we see these thick clouds being ejected at very high speed. They're clearly dense because they flow downward and become part of this large overall pyroclastic flow. What we're basically being told is that the concrete sort of jumped up into midair, exploded itself, and then was ejected as the floors came together. Not a very plausible mechanism, but I have yet to hear of anything else proposed to explain it. From quite a few people on the scene, we've been told that the powder it represented most of the concrete, that the amount of intact macroscopic chunks of concrete on the scene were negligible, that basically everything was reduced to powder. And incidentally, we also know that other things besides concrete were reduced to powder. We know that contents of computers, exotic metals from computer chips, these sorts of things were also identified in the dust and in very small particles, generally on the order of less than 100 microns in diameter. So we have a real issue of mechanism as far as what in the process of this collapse could cause so many things to be pulverized so finely. For the towers to collapse the way we saw them collapse basically implies that the columns simply collapsed into themselves. They telescoped straight down. Steel keeps a lot of its structural integrity even when heated. Until you begin to approach the melting point, you don't really see a catastrophic loss of strength, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about basically vertical box columns collapsing into themselves, which implies a complete loss of mechanical strength. And as far as the initial impacts, this recent NIST study made an interesting point about World Trade Centers 2. The film analysis showed that it oscillated for about 4 minutes after it was struck by the airplane, and the oscillation rate was identical to what would be expected for the intact tower. Trade Center towers in most modern buildings are heavily redundant in the sense that the load bearing can be shifted to other members if some of them fail, and we saw that happen in this case. Stresses do redistribute, but absent further weakening of the structural members, that distribution is limited. It happens, the structure restabilizes, and unless there's significant further damage, it doesn't progress to a total collapse. World Trade 1 began collapsing from the very top after an hour and 40 minutes. It's very hard to imagine office contents progressively heating up hotter and hotter over that period of time. And for a building to collapse from the very top, which is the least heavily loaded, is also very odd, to say the least. Just a couple of other anomalies. As we know, there were reports of explosions. There were reports of underground explosions in both of the towers at the time of the impact from a building engineer by the name of Philip Morelli. There are interviews with him on the web. From the Naudet brothers film, 9/11, we see that the lobby of the North Tower was extensively damaged with what looks like high explosive blast damage, and this was immediately after the plane collision. But we know that on the weekend before there were power downs, and there appear to have been evacuation drills going on throughout the previous week, which suggests that at least some people knew that something was happening. The power downs may represent a time window in which demolition charges would have been planted, although I think it's possible that they also were planted over a much longer period of time, given the relative accessibility of the buildings. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Everybody has seen photos of the attack on September 11th. These photos make it appear as if a few Arabs attacked America, and that the airplane crashes and the fires caused the buildings to collapse. However, when we take a close look at how the buildings collapsed, we can see evidence that explosives were used. For example, dust shot out of a few windows far below the collapsing area. This dust is caused by extremely high pressure, but it comes out of only a few windows. It is a couple hundred feet below the collapsing area. When we look closely at the area that is collapsing, we find dust shooting out of every window of the entire floor at the same time. The towers had a steel frame, so the only way they could collapse in such a symmetrical manner is if thousands of joints were broken simultaneously. The towers collapsed in less than 10 seconds, which is an average of 10 floors every second. Next time you see a 10-story building, imagine the entire building collapsing in 1 second. The only buildings that collapse this quickly are the ones destroyed with explosives. The explosives were timed so that the joints were shattered before the rubble contacted the floor below it. In other words, the building broke apart in only 8.4 seconds because explosives, not falling debris, broke the joints. We were told that fire caused the towers to collapse, but no large building has ever collapsed from a fire. This 32-story skyscraper in Madrid, Spain, is a good example. The fire became so intense that it spread from one floor to the next, causing the building to look like a torch. This fire was much larger than the fires at the World Trade Center. The next morning there were still a few fires in the lower floors. Everything inside the building had been burned. Some sections of the building broke. A few portions at the top of the building collapsed. However, the building remained standing, and it continued to support a large construction crane at the top. By comparison, the fire in the South Tower was so small that it never spread to the other side of the tower. This inability to spread is proof that the fire was small. Furthermore, we know that firemen made it up to the fire zones of both towers because they used their handheld radios to send reports of their arrival. The fires were too small to kill firemen, so how could they be large enough to cause the South Tower to disintegrate after burning for only 56 minutes? The fire in Madrid was much more intense, and it burned all night, but it did not cause the building to collapse. Scientists created this temperature map of the rubble 5 days after the collapse. Obviously, the rubble would be cooler after 5 days. Also, firemen sprayed water on the rubble during those 5 days. However, one location in the rubble of Building 7 was above the melting point of aluminum, and so was one location in the rubble of the South Tower. How can a building fall down and 5 days later the pieces are hot enough to melt aluminum? The presidents of 2 different companies that were cleaning up the area said that steel had melted at the bottom of the basements in the towers and Building 7. These incredible temperatures are more evidence that explosives were used. The collapse of Building 7 provides more evidence of explosives. This was a 47-story building with a steel frame. It was not hit by an airplane. It was across the street from the towers. Late in the afternoon, this building collapsed. The government investigated the collapse of this building. After 7 months of investigating, their conclusion was they have no idea why the building collapsed. A few months later, the landlord of the building, Larry Silverstein, announced on television that the fire department demolished the building. The government and the news reporters should have demanded that both Silverstein and the fire department explain what happened to Building 7, but nobody asked any questions. The collapse of Building 7 is identical to the collapse of buildings that are brought down with explosives. The explosives shatter the joints that are holding the building together, and the building falls down at free fall speed. Dust is produced at the base of the building. The accusation that the towers were demolished with explosives is based on scientific fact, and you cannot disagree with it. For example, pieces of a building cannot crash through steel and concrete floors as fast as they fall through the air. The fact that the frames of those towers broke apart in 10 seconds is proof that explosives broke the joints. Building 7 also collapsed in a manner that can only be explained with explosives. This is why the government says they do not know why Building 7 collapsed. Anybody who looks at this evidence and continues to insist that fires caused the buildings to collapse is simply having a difficult time facing the possibility that a government could commit such a crime.
So what about the hijackers? On September 14, 2001, the Department of Justice released the names of the alleged 19 hijackers. But on September 23rd, the BBC reported that Walid al-Shehri was alive and well in Casablanca, Morocco. They also tracked down Abdulaziz Al-Amari, who was an engineer with Saudi Telecom and lost his passport while studying in Denver. In the same article, FBI Director Robert Mueller admitted that the identity of several of the hijackers is in doubt. So how many hijackers turned up alive? At least 9 of them. Wael al-Shehri is alive and well. Mohand al-Shehri is alive in Saudi Arabia. Khaled al-Midar is a computer programmer in Mecca. Salem al-Hazmi works at a chemical plant in Yanbu, Saudi Arabia. Saeed al-Ghamdi is training to be a pilot in Tunis. Ahmed al-Nami is an administrative supervisor for Saudi Airlines. We already covered Walid and Abdulaziz. And last but not least, Mohammed Atta's father claimed to receive a phone call from his son on September 12th. On September 20th and 27th, Mueller admitted on CNN that there is no legal proof to prove the identities of the hijackers. Indeed, after all, not even the official autopsy for Flight 77 lists the hijackers.
It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S., who may have known things they didn't tell us before September 11th. Fox News correspondent Carl Cameron has details in the first of a 4-part series.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. There is no indication that the Israelis were involved in the 9/11 attacks, but investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 9/11 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information. Fox News has learned that one group of Israelis, spotted in North Carolina recently, is suspected of keeping an apartment in California to spy on a group of Arabs who the United States is also investigating for links to terrorism. Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. They repeatedly made contact with U.S. government personnel, the report says, by saying they wanted to sell cheap art or handiwork. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units. Another part of the investigation has resulted in the detention and arrests of dozens of Israelis at American Mall kiosks, where they've been selling toys called Puzzle Car and Zoomcopter. Investigators suspect a front. Shortly after the New York Times and Washington Post reported the Israeli detentions last month, the carts began vanishing. Zoomcopter's webpage says, "We are aware of the situation caused by thousands of mall carts being closed at the last minute. This in no way reflects the quality of the toy or its saleability. The problem lies in the operator's business policies." Why would Israelis spy in and on the U.S.? A General Accounting Office investigation referred to Israel as Country A and said, quote, "According to a U.S. intelligence agency, the government of Country A conducts the most aggressive espionage operation against the U.S. of any U.S. ally." A defense intelligence report said Israel has a voracious appetite for information and, quote, "The Israelis are motivated by strong survival instincts which dictate every facet of their political and economic policies. It aggressively collects military and industrial technology, and the U.S. is a high priority target." The document concludes, quote, "Israel possesses the resources and technical capability to achieve its collection objectives." A spokesman for the Israeli embassy here in Washington issued a categorical denial, saying any suggestion that Israelis are spying in or on the U.S. is, quote, "simply not true." There are other things to consider, and in the days ahead, we will take a look at the U.S. phone system and law enforcement's methods for wiretaps, and an investigation into the possibility that both have been compromised by our friends and allies overseas. Brett?
Carl, what about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected, none of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Brett.
This going to the fact that they were spying on some Arabs, right?
Correct.
All right, Carl, thanks.
As the World Trade Center burned, across the river in New Jersey, 5 Israeli Mossad agents celebrated and filmed the attacks as they happened. These 5 Israeli Army veterans were arrested by the FBI after several witnesses saw them dancing, high-fiving, and celebrating. A caller to the Jersey City Police described them as dressed like Arabs. In their van was $4,700 in cash, stashed in a sock, foreign passports, and a pair of box cutters, the same weapon allegedly used by the September 11th hijackers. They were part of an Israeli moving company front. The Israeli owner fled the country after being interrogated. The Israeli spies were later deported to Israel.
I want to take you back to your report last night on those 60 people who were Israelis who were detained in the anti-terror investigation, and the suspicion that some investigators have that they may have picked up information on the 9/11 attacks ahead of time, not passed it on. There was a report, you'll recall, that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, did indeed send representatives to the U.S. to warn just before 9/11 that a major terrorist attack was imminent. Why does that not? How does that leave room for the lack of a warning?
Well, I remember the report, Britt. We did it first internationally right here on your show on the 14th. What investigators are saying is that that warning from the Mossad was nonspecific and general, and they believe that it may have had something to do with the desire to protect what are called sources and methods in the intelligence community. The suspicion being perhaps those sources and methods were taking place right here in the United States. The question came up in the Select Intelligence Committee on Capitol Hill today. They intend to look into what we reported last night, and specifically that possibility. Brett?
So, in other words, the problem wasn't the lack of a warning. The problem was lack of useful details.
Quantity of information.
All right, Carl, thank you.
The Mossad is the Israeli intelligence agency. The Mossad has been responsible for kidnappings, assassinations, and bombings. Their motto is, by way of deception, thou shalt make war. A Mossad cell was depicted in the Steven Spielberg film Munich.
Now, I turn it on. He picks up the phone, turns on the red light. Then take up the key, insert it, and turn.
Oui? Mahmoud Hamshari.
Yes?
If Al-Shir sleeps in his closet, we're in trouble. But if he gets in the bed, his weight arms the device, closes the circuit, then we hit the remote.
That way.
Don't you dare hold me on that! Stop it! My son died at 67, you foul-mouthed son of a bitch! Everything you can ask I've done for Israel.
Ask for a reassignment, if this is so distasteful.
Why, it's not distasteful to you.
No. Because the only blood that matters to me is Jewish blood.
Two workers from the Israeli instant messaging service Odigo were sent warnings 2 hours before the Twin Towers attack. Odigo had its U.S.-based headquarters only 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. Odigo's Israeli-based headquarters are in the same town as the Mossad's headquarters. Shortly after 9/11, Odigo was purchased by another Israeli-owned company, Comverse.
Israeli-based company called Amdocs that generates the computerized records and billing data for nearly every phone call made in America. As Carl Cameron reported, U.S. investigators digging into the 9/11 terrorist attacks fear that suspects may have been tipped off to what they were doing by information leaking out of Amdocs. In tonight's report, we learned that the concern about phone security extends to another company founded in Israel that provides the technology that the U.S. government uses for electronic eavesdropping. Here is Carl Cameron's third report.
The company is Comverse Infosys, a subsidiary of an Israeli-run private telecommunications firm with offices throughout the U.S. It provides wiretapping equipment for law enforcement. Here's how wiretapping works in the U.S. Every time you make a call, it passes through the nation's elaborate network of switchers and routers run by the phone companies. Custom computers and software made by companies like Comverse are tied into that network to intercept, record, and store the wiretapped calls, and at the same time transmit them to investigators. The manufacturers have continuing access to the computers so they can service them and keep them free of glitches. This process was authorized by the 1994 Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA. Senior government officials have now told Fox News that while CALEA made wiretapping easier, it has led to a system that is seriously vulnerable to compromise and may have undermined the whole wiretapping system. Indeed, Fox News has learned that Attorney General John Ashcroft and FBI Director Robert Mueller were both warned October 18th in a hand-delivered letter from 15 local, state, and federal law enforcement officials who complained that, quote, law enforcement's current electronic surveillance capabilities are less effective today than they were at the time CALEA was enacted. Comverse insists the equipment it installs is secure, but the complaint about this system is that the wiretap computer programs made by Comverse have in effect a back door through which wiretaps themselves can be intercepted by unauthorized parties. Adding to the suspicions is the fact that in Israel, Comverse works closely with the Israeli government and under special programs gets reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by the Israeli Ministry of Industry and Trade. But investigators within the DEA, INS, and FBI have all told Fox News that to pursue or even suggest Israeli spying through Comverse is considered career suicide. And sources say that while various FBI inquiries into Comverse have been conducted over the years, they've been halted before the actual equipment has ever been thoroughly tested for leaks. A 1999 FCC document indicates several government agencies expressed deep concerns that too many unauthorized, non-law enforcement personnel can access the wiretap system. And the FBI's own nondescript office in Chantilly, Virginia, that actually oversees the CALEA wiretapping program, is among the most agitated about the threat. But there is a bitter turf war internally at FBI. It is the FBI's office in Quantico, Virginia, that has jurisdiction over awarding contracts and buying intercept equipment. And for years, they've thrown much of the business to Comverse. A handful of former U.S. law enforcement officials involved in awarding Comverse government contracts over the years now work for the company. Numerous sources say some of those individuals were asked to leave government service under what knowledgeable sources call troublesome circumstances that remain under administrative review within the Justice Department. And what troubles investigators most, particularly in New York in the counterterrorism investigation of the World Trade Center attack, is that on a number of cases, suspects that they had sought to wiretap and surveil immediately changed their telecommunications processes. They started acting much differently as soon as those supposedly secret wiretaps went into place. Brett?
Carl, is there any reason to suspect in this instance that the Israeli government is involved?
No, there's not, but there are growing instincts and an awful lot of law enforcement officials in a variety of agencies who suspect that and have begun compiling evidence and a highly classified investigation into precisely that possibility. Brett?
Recorders themselves are made from the most impervious metals known to man, and the information is recorded along with date and time and spooled into a continuous roll. Any damage that is done to the roll is done to the outside, as opposed to the inside where the data is. The 9/11 Commission says that CVRs and FDRs from American 11 and United 175 were not found. Yet, the FBI claims to have found the passport of Saddam al-Sakami, which managed to fly out of his pocket, through the explosion, and onto the streets of Manhattan below. So, 4 different black boxes, made from the most resilient materials known to man, were destroyed. Yet, a passport, made from a fragile material known as paper, managed to survive? Who writes this stuff?
Asked this week about another sprawling investigation and the detention of 60 Israelis since September 11th, the Bush administration treated the questions like hot potatoes.
I would just refer you to the Department of Justice with it. I'm not familiar with the report.
According to the official story, Daniel Lewin was sitting next to 3 of the 5 Islamic hijackers aboard Flight 11. Daniel Lewin was a member of the world's most elite anti-hijacking team. He was actually a captain in Israel's Sayeret Matkal. A report written only several hours after the September 11th attacks stated that Daniel Lewin was shot fighting the hijackers. How did a gun get on board? The security at all of the 9/11 airports was run by an Israeli-owned company. This is Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff. He is the son of a rabbi and holds Israeli dual citizenship. His last name, Chertoff, means of the devil in Russian. This is the March 2005 issue of Popular Mechanics. The cover story was written by 25-year-old senior researcher Benjamin Chertoff, Michael Chertoff's cousin. What you have been looking at are the creations of the chosen designer of the World Trade Center site, Daniel Libeskind. He specializes in planting alien-looking structures in the middle of white Western traditional architecture. He creates Holocaust and Jewish museums in order to instill white guilt in white countries. This is an actual proposed design for the World Trade Center site. Yes, that building was purposely designed to look as if it is falling over. This is what the World Trade Center site is about to look like. The Project for a New American Century is a neocon think tank composed almost entirely of Jews. They all have some sort of employment within the Bush administration. Their mission statement includes securing the Middle East for Israel through warfare. In 1998, the Project for a New American Century sent a letter to President Clinton urging him to invade Iraq because, according to them, Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. In September of 2000, the Project for a New American Century published a paper titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. In this paper, they claimed that unless there was a new Pearl Harbor, their stated goals would take many years to accomplish. Franklin Roosevelt married his cousin, Eleanor. Her maiden name was Roosevelt. As president, Roosevelt ordered the Western Fleet at Pearl Harbor in a formation inside the harbor, as sitting ducks while provoking Japan, killing almost 3,000 sailors. He created Pearl Harbor, forcing isolationist America into a war we never wanted to be involved with. At home, Roosevelt advanced Jewish communism in every way. The Lusitania was a luxury liner which was making a trip from the United States to Britain during World War I. The German embassy handed out a public warning dockside beforehand, warning the passengers that Britain and Germany were at war and warning passengers not to take the voyage. A German U-boat encountered the ship off the coast of Ireland and fired a torpedo. The torpedo triggered a second explosion in the ship. The Germans claim this explosion was from the hidden munitions aboard the ship. Part of the cargo was in fact military in nature. 4,200,000 rounds of Remington rifle cartridges, 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells, and 18 cases of fuses were only part of the cargo being smuggled from so-called isolationist America to Britain. Immediately after the sinking, Germany accused Britain of deliberately conspiring to have Lusitania sunk to draw the United States into World War I on the side of the Allies. And this is exactly what happened. In January 1898, the USS Maine was sent to Havana, Cuba, to monitor the volatile situation. 3 weeks later, an explosion destroyed the USS Maine. 266 men lost their lives as a result of the disaster. Immediately, newspapers and other sources were blaming Spanish mines for the attack. War against Spain was demanded by the citizens of America. This explosion was the pretext for the Spanish-American War. Too bad later investigations almost unanimously reveal that mechanical malfunctions or powder ignition inside the Maine was the actual cause for the destruction of the ship. Certain people wanted war, and they got it. False flag operations are covert operations which are designed to appear as if they are being carried out by other entities. Israel has a long history of known false flag attacks, many against the United States. The USS Liberty was a clearly marked American intelligence ship in international waters and flying a large American flag.
It was no enemy that tried to sink the Liberty. It was America's ally, Israel, then fighting its Arab neighbors in the Six-Day War. The survivors have always said the attack was no accident.
We were well known, and the attack was obviously deliberate. I consider it this cold-blooded murder of American sailors that day.
Yet Israel insists it was a tragic case of mistaken identity.
It's very embarrassing for a military force like the Israeli Defense Forces to make such a blunder, no doubt. But we admit our mistake. That does not mean that there was any intention or any conspiracy or anything of the sort.
But the men of the Liberty claim there was a conspiracy, and that it's been covered up for 35 years.
If it was an accident, it was the best planned accident I've ever heard of. We were sent around the world, wherever there might be a hot spot, to see if we could determine what was going on and if the United States desired any intervention of any sort.
That evening, the Liberty arrived at her destination, off the Sinai coast. Thursday, the 8th of June, dawned fine and clear. But the war was still raging, and Israeli planes flew out from the Sinai Peninsula to check on the Liberty.
Reveille was at 6. You got up, you showered and everything, and you go for a chow. But before that, we had heard that, like at 5 in the morning, or around that time, that the planes were buzzing us.
The Israeli aircraft seemed to be identifying the ship as belonging to their ally, America.
There were about 9 different occasions that airplanes came out, probably 12 times that were circled, 12 separate orbits of the ship during the morning.
Lloyd Painter relieved Ennis as officer of the deck. He too was reassured by the presence of the Israeli planes.
I remember vividly looking out through the portholes, looking down on the 01 level, and seeing all the officers sunbathing. And at the same time, we were being overflown, and I remember feeling very good and very warm inside that we were safe. They knew who we were. We were not a stranger out there that day.
Confident that the Israelis knew who they were, the Liberty men relaxed. A new flag was flying, visibility was perfect, and they'd received no orders to leave the area. That sense of security was about to be brutally shattered. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the officers on the bridge spotted 3 Delta Wing Mirage jets.
I saw them come at us. In fact, I was looking through the porthole when the jets came down and leveled off on us at attack attitude.
To my surprise, there were red flashes under the wings, and missiles, rockets started hitting the ship.
But the portholes were blown out instantly. Mine in my chest. The fellow next to me got it in his face. And we all went down on the deck with the force of the concussion from the glass.
The next thing I heard down in my space was a panicky announcement on the loudspeaker 1MC. General quarters, this is no drill. General quarters, ship is under attack. And you hear ping, 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 ping.
The decks above were being shredded. Attempts to send an SOS message failed. The Liberty's frequencies were being jammed.
You'd have to know what frequencies we were going to come up on. To know that, you'd have to know that we were an American ship. If you knew we were an American ship, you knew what frequencies we were going to be on because you knew what the fleet frequencies were. Duh! Hello!
The attackers knew their target, but they were keeping their own identity well hidden.
During the attack, no one saw any markings, and some of the men told me later that they made a special effort to identify them, and they swear that there were no markings, that these airplanes were unmarked.
They took out all of our transmitting antennas, and shortly thereafter deposited napalm on the deck. It appeared to me that it was the intent of the attacker to take out all communications and keep all people off deck so they couldn't reestablish any sort of antennas or communication system. If it was an accident, it was the best planned accident I've ever heard of. The only reason we got the SOS out was because my crazy troops were climbing the antenna string and long wires while they were being shot at.
At the end of the air attack, 8 men were dead and 75 injured. But the worst was yet to come.
We immediately cast off our lines and rushed out. I at least didn't know why. The sea was very calm and a bright day. I think it was around midday, or maybe a little before that, but around midday. And only on the way we were told there was an unknown vessel to the south of us, or southwest of us, and we sped over in that direction. Very soon we did see a ship, clearly a naval vessel.
The last thing I remember is the captain on the intercom system saying, "Stand by for torpedo attack, starboard side."
Down below the waterline, the men in the engine room got ready to die.
Torpedoes coming in, it's going to open that boiler up, and you're going to die instantly. It's going to be like an atomic bomb, because that cold water hits that boiler, it's operating at full, there's just no hope. So all of us 19-year-olds, the best place to be is right there. You're going to get it, you're going to give it up right then and there. So torpedo attack, we waited, and they said it went by. And this went on like 4 different times.
The torpedo is simply dropped into the water. You lose sight of it for a minute, and then you see the wake, and it was going straight for the ship, and we were sure that our torpedo was the one that hit.
It hit, and it lifted the ship right out of the water and put it down, and we started to list 10 degrees. But it was a slow list, and it was going. And I said, my God, we're going to flip over.
I was one of the fortunate ones. A temporary bulkhead wrapped itself around me, and the heat of the torpedo exploded all of the paint onto my skin. So I was black, but it was all superficial. Lost both eardrums, got my eyes burnt a little, but I survived. Almost all of the troops within 20 feet of me were killed instantly.
We just went back to work and prayed that this thing was not going to flip over, or if it was going to go down, and it didn't. That's about it for now.
The Liberty was now paralyzed, her power and steering control lost. But her desperate SOS message had been picked up by the American 6th Fleet, 500 miles away off Crete. Retaliation was ordered for the attack. On the USS America, 2 bombers were readied while their fighter escort was launched.
Those aircraft were brought forward, and I believe they were launched before we went into Condition November.
Condition November meant that nuclear-armed A-4 bombers were to be used. Incredibly, the US was about to launch a nuclear strike against Egypt, the Liberty's presumed attacker.
One of them was taxied forward to Cat 1, and it was it had like a shroud around the underside of the fuselage, and it had Marine guards escorting the A4. So that was a very unusual experience. I've never seen anything like that.
There was a flash message, as I recall, from one of the carriers that said they had launched ready aircraft. The launching of ready aircraft, you understand, that is typically nuclear-armed aircraft.
Cairo was about to be incinerated. The US Embassy was told that an attack was coming. Richard Parker was the political consul.
There was this message that the Navy was preparing to retaliate against Egypt for the attack on the Liberty. They thought that it was the Egyptians who attacked it. They were preparing to attack Egypt in response.
A few minutes later, Tony Hart passed a Pentagon message through to the Navy. Recall the aircraft.
My first thought was, as well, we don't want to do mushroom clouds. The recall probably is to rearm the aircraft.
About 10 minutes later, the USS America and Washington were connected by voice link. The Defense Secretary himself came on the line.
McNamara directed Comm 6 Fleet to recall the aircraft, and Comm 6 Fleet said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Absolutely certain. Recall the aircraft."
The attack on the Liberty had triggered an extraordinary response. Nuclear-armed planes had been on their way to Cairo. A nuclear strike had been minutes away and had only just been averted. But it seems McNamara was also unwilling to send aircraft directly to help the Liberty. The fleet commander asked for permission to send a rescue flight of conventionally armed aircraft.
The admiral was talking to McNamara and asking for permission to relaunch the ready aircraft, relaunch any aircraft. And McNamara said no, that no aircraft were to be launched. McNamara is the boss, you know. He doesn't have to explain why he says what he says.
Dave Lewis heard from another officer about McNamara's dealings with the 6th Fleet.
I'm Admiral Larry Geis, the commander of Task Force 60.
He was very upset. He told me he knew it was going to be hushed up, and I wasn't to say anything about it, but he had to get it off his chest. That he had sent aircraft and notified Washington, obviously via the Criticom network, because it got to Bob McNamara and Lyndon Johnson, and he had the aircraft recalled by Robert McNamara. So he said he reconfigured a flight of aircraft with aircraft incapable of carrying nuclear weaponry and relaunched it. He again notified Washington. Again, Robert McNamara ordered the aircraft recalled. He challenged the order, and Lyndon Johnson came on. He said he didn't give a damn if the ship sunk. He would not embarrass his allies.
Robert McNamara has never fully discussed his role in the Liberty controversy.
You recalled planes sent to rescue the Liberty.
I'm absolutely certain that's false.
You didn't send a signal to the 6th Fleet?
Absolutely not. I don't know what the hell happened, and I haven't taken time to find out. But there are all of these claims that we sent planes, the planes were going out and then we turned them around, and that we intentionally allowed the Israelis to sink the Liberty. I know nothing about it.
While the 6th Fleet was launching and recalling its aircraft, the Liberty was still under attack by the Israeli torpedo boats.
You could see these machine gun bullets going through and ricocheting off all the metal that was down there. And actually, some were going into the boiler. They're trying to explode the boiler, and they knew what they were doing.
We basically were dead in the water. The word came down, prepare to abandon ship. That meant prepare only, go up and get ready, get near the life rafts. Well, I went up first, popped the hatch, looked out for the life rafts. They were either gone or burning. And at the same moment, I looked to the stern of the ship, and I saw one of the torpedo boats methodically machine gunning one of our life rafts that had floated back. We cut the life rafts loose because they were burning or had been damaged. And they floated back behind us, and he was machine gunning the life raft. And I knew that had there been anyone in there, they certainly wouldn't be alive. It happened so fast, it didn't seem real. None of the attacks seemed real to me. I was bewildered. I couldn't understand why they would do it to us. I just didn't understand a thing at that point.
These guys didn't die for anything, they just died. They were slaughtered for nothing.
The assault was over, but the cover-up was about to begin. But a presidential election was coming up. Nobody in power wanted to let questions about the USS Liberty spoil relations with victorious Israel. If Jews today can gather at their holiest site, the Wailing Wall, it's because the Six-Day War brought them control of Jerusalem's old city. It's also brought 35 years of violence, hatred, and bloodshed. Since 1967, Israel has become the dominant power in the Middle East, thanks to its alliance with the US. For 35 years, the Liberty veterans have been campaigning for justice and a full inquiry into the attack on their ship.
We need you because it's what keeps us going. We can't do the things we want to do without your help.
We have never learned why it happened that day, why the ravage of war came in our way. We lost our husbands, sons, and friends, and there is no hope our hearts will mend.
The attack on the USS Liberty killed 34 U.S. servicemen and wounded at least 171. The USS Liberty didn't sink quickly, as Israel wished. They got out urgent distress signals to a United States carrier in the area. By using unmarked aircraft, the clear intent of this attack was to blame the attack on Egypt, bringing America into the Six-Day War on Israel's side. Clearly, by attacking this ship, Israel knew all about what really happened with Pearl Harbor, the Lusitania, and the Maine. This is a textbook example of what is called a false flag attack. Here's another example of a false flag operation designed to trick the United States into attacking Israel's enemies. The Lavon Affair. In 1954, Israeli agents working in Egypt planted bombs in several buildings, including a United States diplomatic facility, and left evidence behind implicating Arabs as the culprits. The ruse would have worked had not one of the bombs detonated prematurely, allowing the Egyptians to capture and identify one of the bombers, which in turn led to the roundup of an Israeli spy ring. It is therefore a fact that Israel has a prior history of committing attacks with the intent to blame Arabs for them. As a result of September 11th, the United States has invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, two nations which had absolutely nothing to do with the attack on America, which cost about 3,000 lives. These are wars for Israel. And now, the same Zionist Jews are pushing for a war against Iran. Is Iran really a threat to America? Would they nuke America? America has a nuclear arsenal which could destroy their entire country. Mexico is a much greater threat to the United States than Iran. Iran is only a threat to Israel. And Israel has a lot to be worried about. After all, this is a country so evil, so oppressive, They run over young American girls with bulldozers. Are Arabs innocent? Hell no. Arabs have no business being in white Western countries in the first place, and we have no business being in theirs. Muslim invaders in Europe brutally murdered Theo van Gogh, related to the brilliant painter Vincent van Gogh. Arabs rape, murder, and riot across Europe. They do not belong there, and neither do Jews. Through subverting the culture, government, churches, media, courts, and schools of white Western countries, Jews are now in complete control of almost all traditionally white countries. Don't believe me? Old men, historians, are now in prison for, quote, denying the Holocaust in countries such as Germany and Austria. Some of these men were actually deported from the United States. Jews have always pushed for massive non-white immigration. Just recently, Jewish Senator Arlen Specter headed the Senate Judiciary Committee, which passed an amnesty legislation.
Let me begin with you. This is a very emotionally charged issue, and probably the most loaded word is amnesty. Because the bill you're talking about would give a path to citizenship or legal status for illegal immigrants, Congressman Tancredo and his allies say that's thinly disguised amnesty. How do you respond?
It is not amnesty, George, because these undocumented aliens are going to have to pay a fine. They're going to have to work for 6 years to be on the citizenship path. They're going to have to go through a criminal background check. They're going to be checked out very, very carefully. They're not going to go ahead of people who have been waiting in line for citizenship. They're going to go to the end of the line for people who have stayed at home and gone through the normal channels. We're facing a difficult situation because we have approximately 11 million undocumented aliens here, and we've got to find some way to deal with them. We have a national security problem. They've not been identified. If we do not have some realistic proposal to give them an opportunity to work lawfully and ultimately to obtain citizenship, then they're going to be fugitives. And we need to know who they are and where they are. And if they have criminal records, we need to send them back to their country of origin. But if they're prepared to work to become American citizens in the long line traditionally of immigrants who have helped make this country, we can have both a nation of laws and a welcoming nation of workers who do some very, very important jobs for our economy.
There you go, Congressman Tancredo. He says it's not an amnesty.
Let's see. The Black's Law Dictionary defines an amnesty as a sovereign act of forgiveness for past acts granted by a government to all persons or a certain class of persons who have been guilty of a crime or a deceit. Now, let me tell you, it is an amnesty. The crime they have committed is coming into this country without our permission. The penalty that is supposed to be applied to that under the law that we have today is deportation. If you say you can be here, you can do that, you can come across the border without our permission, and you will be able to stay. And yes, there will be some, a little fine or whatever. It's not deportation. It is amnesty.
The reaction Americans truly wanted on September 11th was deportation and restricted immigration. But the Jewish-controlled United States responded to stateless Islamic terrorism by invading Afghanistan and then Iraq, led by a non-Islamic Saddam Hussein, who did not have weapons of mass destruction and proved it. Turn on MTV, owned by Sumner Redstone, whose real name is Murray Rothstein, and you will be bombarded with 24/7 race-mixing propaganda. Here's a clip from the MTV show Date My Mom.
Now, Donna looks like she sucked on some head before. What's your daughter's name?
Her name is Andrea, but we call her Drea for short.
Can you give me like a brief description of what she looks like, head to
She
toe?
kind of looks a little bit of combination of me and Jodie Foster.
So you're saying she looks like a 45-year-old lesbian? Is she like sexually active?
Not in front of me.
No, is she getting poked or does she not be getting poked, you know?
Sure she has.
Sure she has? Not to your knowledge? You have a certain age, you want your daughter to wait and go?
A little too late for that.
I like them little freak of legs. She bring any embarrassing stories you can have for me about Drea?
Yeah, and she'll probably hate me for telling you this. One time we were all at a restaurant, and my oldest son was eating, and he started laughing and shot food out. So I started laughing so hard that I snorted, and she started laughing, and she farted. So
did she poot or did she fart? Was it like, poot?
No, it was loud enough for somebody next to us to get up and walk out.
Ah, damn. Ooh, dripping out the booty juice.
And MTV is just a tiny portion of the greater Viacom network, which controls Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, Cradle to the Grave. Every base is covered to destroy white Western civilization and values. What about George Bush and Dick Cheney? Some people act as if they are the puppet masters, and if we get rid of them, the skies will clear and everything will be beautiful again. They are evil people, no doubt. Bush is a puppet, just like every modern president before him. And the ones who got out of line, specifically trying to end the Jewish control of the money system, were shot. Jews control the money system. The Federal Reserve is an unconstitutional, privately owned Jewish bank. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. Just before Christmas, when most of Congress was on vacation. The goal of the Jew World Order is to destroy all ethnically pure nation-states. See, pure ethnic states would never allow a hostile alien minority to gain control of their country. However, a country distracted and divided is easily enslaved by the powerful and rich capitalist/communist Jewish network. Both the Republicans and Democrats are controlled by Jews. Here's Ken Melman, chairman of the Republican Party, speaking in front of La Raza, which means the race in Spanish. White people are being ethnically cleansed worldwide. They are moving away from the flood of non-white immigration. You see foreign languages everywhere in traditionally white countries. Our birth rate is dropping due to the demoralization of the Jewish media. And all around, whites are being killed and raped by blacks, Hispanics, and Arabs in large numbers.
The assailant has multiple warrants, and to avoid arrest, he beats the officer senseless while his daughter watches in horror.
Christina, get in the car. Go, baby, I can't go to jail.
Whether you want to admit it or not, we are now in a fight for our land, for our nation. We didn't start this fight. We have to finish it. A lot of you think that I am extreme. Maybe you're right. But it's going to take extreme measures to recover the United States of America. And as I go out tonight with my theme music, a song called Extreme Ways, I want you to consider what white America used to be like. When we were growing up and we didn't have to lock our cars, lock our homes, when we could go out and play in the streets for hours at a time and not fear being robbed, beaten, raped, or killed. We could leave the keys in our car. We can have that again. We can have our safe, decent America. We don't have to have alarms on our doors and our houses and our cars. We don't have to fear going into neighborhoods. We can have that again. But it's going to take a lot of pain. It's going to take a lot of violence. And there's nothing wrong with fighting to recover what we had as a nation. I have seen so much pain on so many faces. I've seen so many dirty things in dirty places. I have watched as my country has become a third world cesspool, and I won't take it anymore.
Carl, what about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected, none of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Britt.
Let me mention, by the way, that this is the first and only time in history that any steel structure skyscrapers are ever collapsed due to fire. It has never before been recorded in the history of structural engineering, before or since. So the government is asking us to believe that on this one day, 9/11, as it were, the laws of physics were suspended and phenomena never before known to structural engineering were taking place just in this exact location. Here is World Trade Center building number 7. This was a 47-story skyscraper, which if it hadn't been surrounded by 110-story buildings would have been regarded as quite a substantial building. This building fell at 5:25 p.m., never having been hit by any aircraft and only having sustained 2 relatively small fires. And it was brought down by what we know was a controlled demolition, because Larry Silverstein, who had leased the World Trade Center about 6 months before all these events took place and insured the buildings at quite a substantial chunk of money in the billions of dollars, for which he then collected twice by insisting it was 2 different attacks, had a conversation with somebody he described as the chief of police, where Silverstein reported he told the chief, well, there's been so much death and destruction, maybe the best thing we can do is pull it.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Where the term pulling, of course, in construction means take it down by controlled demolition. This building came down perfectly symmetrical, fell into its own footprint. Absolutely crystal clear that that is what happened to World Trade Center 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it.
It's just so sad, to just watch the people. They never wake up. They never wake up no matter what. Most people still believe 9/11 really happened, that some Arab terrorist flew some planes into the building. But when on the internet, when it says, well, out of the 19 that did that, are still alive and in Saudi Arabia, they just ignore that truth. They just ignore all this obvious truth that would prove that 9/11 was an absolute 100% government inside job. But then again, this government is controlled by the Itzalai government, and they brought down those buildings. And old Silverman, he collected 400% on the buildings on the insurance. Magically doubled the insurance 2 months before, paid 2 premiums, and then the buildings came down. What a lucky Jew! I mean, you just can't. You often wonder. You sit out here and you wonder which is the worst: the evil, filth, scumbag Jews, Satan and their kids, the Jews, You wonder if that's the worst thing, or the stupid and pathetic brainwashed white race out here who can't find their ass with both hands. Excuse my French. They're so pathetically stupid.
In the broad daylight.
In the broad that they can't, that they sit here and they work as slaves for the Jew factories, making 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 bucks an hour, hoping that, and they're willing to do that 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 51 weeks a year. They get the week vacation, and they're going to do that for 45 years from 20 to 65 and hope to get a gold watch and a pension that's about a third of what their salary was, and they won't be able to make it on that. And then they're depending on Social Security on top of that, which went broke long ago. They stole all the money out of that long ago, and the only thing that's supporting it now is a current worker, and it's just a big, giant show game. That's the white race mentality. They go to the church, they listen to that phony, lying preacher who's been taught in the seminaries by the Jew professors, and they know nothing about the word of Yahweh in there. I mean, the white race just never wakes up to any Jew scams. It's just amazing to me.
No way in the city except for emergency vehicle. I did pass through a couple of parks and on some of the streets, and before, when I reported about an hour ago, there were people at their gas pumps who turned to look at the smoke that was coming from the city, started stepping out of bodegas and stores to look. Now people are gathering in large groups. In fact, in one corner I saw a group of people actually holding hands and praying. As I stand on the Manhattan Bridge, which is